Chicago.
Get this up. You know what? I'm just gonna open it. Okay, turn it on. So you might have to bring it back. Good morning, Chicago. You're listening to Inspirational Perspective. I'm your host, Linal Harris, Chicago's own life coach, right here on WBON 1690 AM, the talk of Chicago. Inspirational Perspective on your radio is all about murdering mediocrity and living the best life possible. So as I ask you every Sunday morning, are you living the best life possible? And this is the place to be, to explore that possibility. All right, well, very excited this Sunday morning for the show that we have prepared for you guys. Some wonderful guests I'm going to introduce in a moment here. But before I get into that, again, my name is Linal Harris, host of Inspirational Perspective, and today is the 14th day. I can't help but say this because we're gonna spend most of the show talking about Dr. Martin Luther King. But with this being the 14th day or the 15th day of the new year, what I know has happened based on research is those of you who have set goals, it is very likely that you have possibly had a breakdown in some of those goals. And the reason why this is important is because I want you to know that this Sunday morning you can start all over again. You can recycle those goals and move forward. All right? Now, if this is the first time you've heard me, you don't know anything about me, I'm going to challenge you to go out to the website slayyourgoals.com and download my free book. Take advantage of the book, read the book, and learn how to get started even when you have a breakdown. Because that's what life is all about. Hitting resistance and then starting all over again. So, I wanted to share that before I got into the topic of the show. As always, those of you who want to follow us on Facebook, please do so. And we're streaming live video right now here in the studio on Facebook Live and Periscope. So thank you guys for joining. I already have the audience here. And with that, I want to go ahead and introduce the topic and introduce my guest that we'll be chatting with today, who will be joining us throughout the morning. So, first and foremost, it's my distinct pleasure to have both Salim and Dometi as a part of this conversation. So, Salim, good morning, sir. How are you?
I'm well, Linal. Good morning to you, my brother. How are you doing?
I'm well, and I'm excited, by the way, that you accepted this invitation and that you'll be having this conversation with us. Now, for the listening audience, so that you guys know, the topic this morning is Dr. King, 50 years later. 3 generations, 3 perspectives. And it looks like I just lost Salim. So hopefully he'll be calling back in. But that's the topic this morning. Now, the idea was this, right? Many of us have different perspectives of Dr. King, of what Dr. King has done, and what I wanted to do is capture those perspectives, not just in terms of what we think of Dr. King, but more importantly, the generations that he's impacted with his work. So that's why I asked both Salim and Dometi to join. So, and Salim, I think you're back.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, I'm very, very happy to have you guys here. And here's the other piece right here. This is what we'll be discussing ultimately. So I've asked Salim and Dometi both to prepare 3 perspectives, 3 highlights from the life of Dr. King. Okay. And then lastly, I've asked them to prepare in the second hour. So we'll talk about that in the first hour. And in the second hour, I've asked them to then share how do we move forward. Dr. King is no longer here. One of the things that we've talked about as a community is that there's no leadership. So I want to discuss, is leadership necessary, and how do we move forward as a community overall? So Salim, thank you for being here. Dometi is on. Dometi, if you're listening, call the 773-591-1690 number, because for some reason I can't keep you and Salim on at the same time. All right, cool. So he's going to do that, and then we'll have Dometi on as well. But Salim, since I have you, I love your thoughts on what you like to get out of the show this morning, and what you like to contribute to the listeners.
I have a pretty complicated relationship to the idea of Dr. King, to him himself, and to the idea that he represents. The nonviolent resistance. I first encountered Dr. King when he was leading a demonstration in New Jersey.
Oh wow! I think Salim just got cut off.
Well, now, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but Salim got cut off. So yeah, we got to figure out how to have both of you on at the same time. For some reason, he got cut off when I went to you.
Oh man, it was about to be good too.
It was about to be really good, because I definitely want Salim's perspective on this. So we got to figure out how to have. Well, and I know you're heading into the studio, Dometi. So
yeah.
What I may ask you is, once you get into the studio, we'll begin the conversation with you. And for now, I'll let Salim start. How about that?
Let's do that. That's wonderful.
Okay.
And first of all, Linal, I just got to say thank you for having this conversation. It's so important.
You're welcome.
I think we talk more and more about the division between the generations without talking about how we can learn from one another in a constructive way, and talk about the complexities of who King was and learn from each of those perspectives. So I'm really excited about this. I'm going to come in and see you in studio in just a moment, and I'll be listening in to hear what Salim has to say as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Awesome. So let me go back to Salim real quick. So good morning, Salim.
Yes,
and sorry about that, man. We're gonna have to figure out how to have you.
Sometimes that happens. I don't know what it is. You can't get 2 people on at the same time. Sometimes there's a glitch in the connection.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we want to have callers today too, so we got to figure this one out. So I'll ask Gerald and Patrick to figure this one out, so we can have some callers, because I'm sure you're gonna have people who have questions. But please continue. You were saying that you had a complicated relationship with the ideals of Dr. King. And go ahead.
Yeah, we in the North, we kind of rejected his whole modality. The hymn singing, the overall wearing kind of sensibility that they represented was something that was we weren't quite with that. We had a different sensibility. We were urban folks, city boys. And we didn't think that the "we shall overcome" and passive resistance thing was to our liking. You know, we weren't with that too strongly. Malcolm really Malcolm X exemplified the kind of spirit that we had, and so I was a bit reluctant to endorse King's methods when I was a teenager, young teenager, and then I found myself at the march in '63. I was a young boy looking for women. And we heard that there would be a lot of women in Washington D.C.
So is that what drew you there? Was it the movement? And I love your honesty and transparency, but was it the movement, or it sounds like for you it was the social gathering and the likelihood of beautiful women?
Exactly that.
Okay.
That was my lure. That's what pulled me and 4 other brothers to D.C.
Okay.
That day. And in fact, you know, it was true. The rumors were correct. There were a lot of women who were attracted to that movement. And I didn't really even hear Martin Luther King that day. I heard, you know, little echoes of his speech. But what impressed me was the dedication of the people who had attended. You know, there was something beyond themselves that kind of pulled them to the Capitol, and beyond the kind of selfish motives that me and my boys had. And that was very impressive to me in a unique way. I hadn't seen people assemble together for you know, that kind of dedication before, and that struck me very strongly. And then, but still, I was still, you know, it wasn't compatible with my sensibilities at that time. I still rejected the kind of Southern orientation of the King movement. You know, in New York, there was always this strong separation between country people and city people, and the King movement seemed to exemplify the attitudes of country people, and so there was that stylistic division.
And Salim, if I'm not mistaken, you are from New York, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I'm from New York, and then that next year, this was in '63 is when the march happened. The next year there was a riot in Harlem, the first of the long hot summer riots.
Okay.
And
in '64.
In '64.
Okay.
Right? And so that, you know, that hit me in a completely different way. It pushed me into the service, the Air Force. I you know, trying to jump out of the frying pan. I jumped into the fire though, because those were the Vietnam years.
Oh wow! Yeah.
So, but anyway, the point is that King was something that he was kind of an oppositional figure as far as I could see in the beginning. And then as time passed, I began to appreciate his methods, that he was utilizing a strategy that required discipline that I hadn't factored into my considerations before, and so I started to gain new appreciation for Dr. King, and then
And how long did that take, Salim? I mean, because, you know, 63, you're a young guy, you know, you head to D.C. for the march, not to necessarily be a participant, but to to scout out beautiful women. Which how old were you?
I was 16.
Oh wow, yeah. So you were definitely young. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So at what point did you begin to really appreciate King's movement and look outside of the differences of North, South, you know, how Southerners may have approached this versus Northerners, etc.?
That's when he began to oppose the Vietnam War. Because, you know, I was in the service, and it was, you know, I've met some of the most radical people I've ever met in the military, ironically, and they were anti-war strongly. And so when Dr. King came out against the war, I began to really respect his moral courage. The fact that he would do something like that at a time when that was considered outside of the province of most black leadership. appreciated that. And then, of course, when he was assassinated, that increased my appreciation even more, because the contrast of no king made his presence more potent, more poignant.
Yeah.
And then I got shot that same year. You know, I often say that there are three things that I share with Dr. King.
Wow.
That I saw him in '63 at the march. We were both born in January,
Mm-hmm.
and we both were shot in a motel in the South in '68.
Wow.
I got shot in '68 in Georgia.
Didn't know that about you, Salim.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I was shot by a motel owner in the state of Georgia, and in fact, I was one of my marks of infamy, I guess you would say,
Mm-hmm.
is I was written up in Jet magazine as being deceased.
Oh, wow.
Because two servicemen were shot that same weekend. One was shot in another part of Georgia.
Black serviceman.
Black serviceman, right?
Okay.
And he died. I was shot and I lived, but they mixed the names up and had me as dying. So, you know, but my gunshot, the fact that I was a victim of a gunshot and Dr. King was as well. That's the last thing that I have in common with.
Now, Salim, there are probably some listeners who, you know, they're listening to you. They don't know who you are, and what to hear. So for me, because of the influence you've had on me over the last 5 to 6 years, since we've gotten to know each other, you know, to think that we could lose King in '68 and the likes of a Salim Muwakkil is frightening, right? And so let me quickly, you know, share with the listeners who you are, and if I miss anything, by all means, you know, fill it in. But you know, so Salim, first and foremost, is a colleague here at WVON who has a show that aired last night. So more than he's being very generous because he's on the air 3 hours himself, from 6 to 9, right?
From 7 to 10. Actually.
From 7 to 10. Why don't I know that? I followed you at 10 for 5 years, right? So, yeah, for 7 to 10. And he's also a senior editor at In These Times magazine, former adjunct faculty at UIC, journalist for multiple publications, and in my opinion, one of our sages, one of the sages of our community. Having learned from you, Salim, listened to you, and the depth of knowledge that you have is just mind blowing. So,
thank you, brother. Appreciate that, man.
And well, I'm saying it because it's true. Anyone who knows me knows that I don't fluff my words. So, you know, I say what is true. And so, Salim, to hear that, it's like, wow. And at the time, you were 21 years old?
Yes, sir.
21 years old.
Yeah, I got shot, man, and that turned me even. In fact, that's what made me. That's what radicalized me to a great extent, because I had to stay in the service as I recuperated, and as soon as I was discharged, I joined the Black Panther Party.
Got it.
So I was, you know, appreciative of King. Mm-hmm. But I thought he had the wrong perspective. I thought revolution was the only answer at that time. Got it.
Yeah. Okay.
I later mellowed as well. And again, you know, his wisdom has reined me back in a sense.
So I want to talk about your experience with the Black Panther Party, but I want to jump first, right? And by the way, we got Emmanuel Leonard in the studio. So Emmanuel, if you have any questions for Salim that pop into your mind, please, by all means. And we'll be getting Dometi's perspective in a moment in terms of a millennial before the end of the hour. But I want to jump. So I want to kind of do a hyper jump to where you began to mellow out. And the ideologies of King began to, in some ways, maybe to absorb to a point where they influenced certain aspects of you. And I'm curious, which of those ideologies really stood out for you?
Well, you know,
it concerns our own response to injustice. It concerns disciplining our own emotions to deal with the kind of disappointments we find. So it's as therapeutic internally as it is effective politically.
Mm-hmm.
And I understood Dr. King from another angle of vision, and his profundity became more apparent to me. I saw how multidimensional he was really in his approach. He was doing a lot of things at the same time, things that we didn't even realize. I see now, and so I gained enormous appreciation for the man and for the way he fit into that time in history, the way he used that time in history
mm-hmm.
to deal with issues beyond political effects.
Yeah, absolutely. No. Thanks for sharing that. So so now that you shared that piece of it, I would love for you to go back to your experience within the Black Panther Party, and maybe and help us with time frame, right? Because at this point, Dr. King has been assassinated. I'm sure that in the Black community there's confusion, right? And when I say confusion, likely there are many who want to continue to follow the path of Dr. King, but then there are others who are, I'm sure, infuriated that this has happened.
Mm-hmm.
And they may move to the other side, right? Of saying, hey, there is something that we need to do forcibly to ensure, our freedom, our civil rights. Where were you with all of that, and what was your experience in the Black Panther Party?
Well, the assassination of King, of course, propelled a lot of people into more radical movements because they concluded that King's methods were ineffective, and that if you profess nonviolence, all they'll do is kill you.
Mm.
And so we have to chart another course. And so I think it gave a big impetus to the Panther Party at that time. It experienced a pretty vigorous spurt of growth during that period.
Got it.
68. 69. That had. In fact, that was the year later. That year was the year that Fred Hampton was assassinated.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people opted for more radical expressions.
Mm-hmm.
Not just the Panther Party, but also the cultural nationalists were also strong. That's like Ron Karenga and on the West Coast, and Amamo Baraka on the East Coast, and here in Chicago, Haki Mahabuti, and a few other people, Conrad, Warrell. A lot of people were opting for black nationalism.
Got it. And were you in Chicago yet, Salim, at that time? Were you?
No, I wasn't.
Okay.
I wasn't in Chicago. I was still based on the East Coast,
okay.
New York, New Jersey area. In fact, I was going to Rutgers University at the time.
Okay.
And eventually, I became a little bit disenchanted with the Panthers. It seemed like they were all catharsis and little programs.
And tell me what you mean by that.
We did a lot of provocative things, man. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, we had some very admirable programs. We had a tutorial program for young kids in our community. We had a medical screening program for sickle cell anemia and those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And we enlisted medical professionals to do work, but it was all voluntary for them.
Okay.
And we had to really insist that they do it. And much of what we did amounted to extortion. We didn't have a self-sustaining funding base. We were basically acting on activism and anger. Mm-hmm. And so we would say that the store owners, either you donate or your store might not be here in the morning, that kind of stuff.
Got it. Yep.
So that was ineffective. And I began to see there was a group that was more serious about all of this and quite very, very serious about building their own institutions, not talking much, simply getting to work and doing what was necessary. And I was a Nation of Islam. I mean, that attracted me at the time.
Okay.
So I moved from the Panther Party to the Nation and became a writer for the paper. What at the time was Muhammad Speaks.
Okay.
I was writing, incidentally, at the time. I was the first black reporter hired for Associated Press in Newark, New Jersey, incidentally, during all of this period. And so I was actually writing for the AP and writing for Muhammad Speaks at the same time.
Wow. that had to be quite the experience.
It was quite the experience.
Talk about. I know a lot of us in Dometi. You could definitely chime in here, but for those of us who are listening to you, right away I think about the side hustle, right? So being a corporate executive, and then having my own thing, and the fear of going to work every day and then finding out about your side hustle that is really your passion, right?
Yes.
Yes, I imagine you were experiencing some of that.
Well, yeah, to a certain extent, but it's ironic, man. In the Nation, you had to be clean cut. That was the ideal.
So that helped.
A lot of my employers thought I was just a clean cut conservative Negro coming to work every day. And I didn't have the big afro that was in style during those times of defiance and whatnot. So they thought I was simply putting my shoulder to the wheel, man.
Well,
thing.
It's funny because when you think about it, some of the most radical of us are clean cut. I mean, Dr. King, Malcolm X.
Yes.
I'm looking at Dometi myself, right? and some of our ideals. I think if people really got into our heads, they'd be like, "Whoa, we got to watch this brother." So,
but at the time, your militants was sometimes judged by the size of your afro.
Absolutely.
It's funny how not much has changed. Like now, your militants is judged by the length of your locks or something like that. Yeah. Everything comes full circle.
Very, very interesting. Well, Salim, thank you. I want to. So what I want to do is I want to share real quick my perspective of King.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I would love for both of you all to chime in on it as well in terms of what you think about this. But so as a Gen Xer, I can really appreciate your experience of Dr. King because one, I learned some things in this conversation that I did not know. And the other thing, Salim, is it gives me an appreciation for individuals who may not have been down for the movement. I remember asking my grandmother some time ago. We were driving together. My grandmother is 97 years old. So you right? Yeah, absolutely. So her perspective of the movement is very different, right? And what I romanticize in my mind, based on the relationship I have to King as a Gen Xer, someone who was born in 1976. After a lot of the heated portions of the movement had happened, and by the way, not really comprehending the movement itself until maybe for another decade or a decade and a half. When I asked my grandmother, I was hoping that she would say that she was in the streets of Chicago marching with King, right? And that's what I hoped. What she shared with me is at the time she was middle aged, she had children, 8 to be exact. And in no way would she find herself in a situation where she could be hurt and ruin the economic opportunities she currently had to take care of her family.
That's right.
As a single woman, right? So for her, King was a troublemaker. And he was someone that had come to Chicago and riled up everyone, the black folks and white folks included, because she worked as a nurse, mostly employed by white people. Right? So for her, it was, hey, what do you think of King? And she said that, she would give her, I think he's out here causing trouble. And she, and by the way, she wasn't, you'd say, kind of brown nosing. That was her real perspective, right? In terms of what she told me, that was her perspective on the movement because they had figured out up here in the North in Chicago how to coexist in some ways. Right. And yes, there wasn't a measure of equality, but, it was working. I'm taking care of my family. Okay, I have a roof over my head. I have a vehicle to get back and forth to work. I have some change in the bank, and who is this coming here, activating our young people, activating our children, putting them in harm's way?
Right?
Yeah.
I think it's actually refreshing to hear you give that perspective because.
Hey, Dometi.
What's going on, Salim? How you doing, brother?
I'm all right, my brother. I haven't heard your voice in a while.
Same here. Well, I actually get to hear you every Saturday night, but I haven't had a chance to talk to you directly. So this is a true treat for me.
Yes, sir.
Man, I love it. Yeah, and I think when I listen to this perspective, it's real refreshing because King has become kind of like the prototype, the standard bearer of what it means to be an activist, what it meant to grow up in that time period, to grow up in the 60s. And we don't hear that perspective. When you hear people right now who disagree with Colin Kaepernick, they're like, what would King say? Back in the day, we had unity. Everybody thought the same thing. Mm-hmm. We got this revisionist history where we forget that there were people who had figured out how to live life, how to develop a livelihood, take care of their families, and that he was disrupting that and making their workplaces, uncomfortable.
Absolutely. And I love the word you just used, Dometi, disruption. Because one of the things as human beings that we don't like is change and disruption, right? Yeah. And I even think of this movement currently right now with the NFL and Kaepernick. And what I find is, so my take on it is, well, if there's a brother who is being treated unfairly, and he is in an establishment called the National Football League, and I know what it is to be a brother who is in a corporate environment being treated unfairly, who has skill sets that people are looking over, I know how that feels. Then I am standing by that brother, no matter what the sacrifice may be, right? So that means that on Sundays, I'm not flipping on the NFL. And by the way, like I found out this morning listening to WVON with the NBC update that the Patriots won. I said, oh, okay, they won again. I have no idea what's going on right now, right? Now here's the thing. When I step into the barbershop and I have conversations about this, I'm a disruptor, and so it's Colin Kaepernick, and this is ridiculous, man. And there's so many excuses and reasons why it's okay.
Right.
Because many of us do not want to interrupt the flow of our everyday. We do not want to interrupt the flow of fantasy football and what that makes me feel like to be a champion.
Exactly.
Right? Of this fantasy league. And so instead, what we do is we say, oh, Colin, you know what? He wasn't going to play anyway.
Right.
Right? He wasn't going to play anyway. And, he just making it hard for everybody.
Well, you're right, man. It is. We get habituated to our way of life, no matter how negative it may be. It's what we're used to, and anything that threatens that sense of order is rejected, man, or resisted.
And really, it's this desire among marginalized people to find some sense of normalcy, right? Like, you want to be normal. You just want to have. I think about this day in and day out. Like, as I was thinking about what King's legacy meant, and you look at the fact that he got a PhD in his early 20s, that he was doing all of this in his 20s. I think about what would King be? Who would he be? Had he not had to fight for civil rights?
Man, we're going to talk about that. and we're going to talk about what if King was afraid.
What if King was afraid?
What if he was too afraid? I mean, think about what it takes as a man who has a family, by the way. And I think about this, right? Because I have a wife and a son now. And if something called me forward, right, to disrupt the normalcy of what's happening right now in the United States, where I'm putting myself in harm's way, like how much courage does that take? Not as just a man, right? As a single man. Because there's some things that you can do courageously as a single man because you know you are the only one who will get hurt.
Yeah.
But to know that the people you love could consequently be hurt. I was listening to David Letterman's interview of Barack Obama. And Barack Obama, one of the things he said about having children that I could identify with is that it's like your heart is outside your body walking around. Right? Right? So imagine, here's a man who is married and has children. And by the way, they're being threatened all the time. And he is still pushing forward for what he believes in.
And then he has these FBI shadows just talking about his indiscretions and whatnot, and trying to discredit him that way.
Absolutely. Can you imagine? The tension? I mean, for him, the tension, and then even the tension in his home as he's doing this, where your wife knows what you're doing is righteous. And by the way, the FBI is ensuring that anything that you do that is slightly wrong or wrong, period, right? Mm-hmm. She knows about it.
Right.
Whew.
Yeah. Pressure.
Talk about pressure.
Yeah.
So what I want to do now is, my Salim, first, thank you for sharing so, one, eloquently and authentically your experience of Dr. King. I definitely want to hear yours, Dometi. But so here I am, a Gen Xer. I remember that, maybe about 12, it was about the 6th grade where I really began to form a relationship with Black history and who Dr. King and some of the other members of the movement were, right? And it wasn't until I was a lot older, probably in my 30s, where I began to study Dr. King. And I made Dr. King one of my virtual mentors. And what I mean by that is I decided that, Dr. King was the type of man that I wanted to emulate in terms of what he stood for and the courage he had behind what he stood for. And I decided to study his life, and by studying his life, make him a mentor, someone that I could check into or check in with, right, virtually, to say, I'm scared right now. Dr. King, what would you do? And having absorbed his readings, absorbed his speeches, often he would speak to me and tell me. And so the top 3 things that I've taken from Dr. King as a result of that, the first is this notion of personal immortality. And I believe that one of the things that pushed Dr. King forward, even when he was deathly afraid and he had those pressures that we talked about, is that he knew that he was living life, not just in this moment, but for his own legacy and for the immortality of the ideals that he talked about. And I believe that's one of the things that pushed him and gave him the strength and the courage to navigate some of the things that he had to navigate. That notion of personal immortality, that what I'm doing right now, while it may feel a certain type of way, that if I continue to push, that this is something that 50 years later will make an impact and have an impression on people, and still these ideologies that I'm talking about and this movement that I'm a part of will still have an impact on them and move, Black America forward. So that's one of the first lessons that I learned from him. And, and what I get more than anything is that, you can't cheat death. We all will die. But what it means is that as human beings, we all have the potential to live our lives in such a way that our legacy becomes immortal. So that was the first piece that I learned from him.
That's a powerful lesson, bro.
Yeah. That's heavy.
The second thing that I learned from Dr. King was this concept of shadow casting. And this is similar to the first, but Dr. King talked about shadow casting in some of his books. And what he meant by this is, the ability to be the type of man that the things that I do cast a shadow on a Dometi, right? Or cast a shadow on an Emmanuel, and they have a profound impact on who you become, right? Has a profound impact on who you are. And he got this concept from 2 people in particular. The first was Henry David Thoreau, right? And civil disobedience.
Right.
And what he talked about was how Henry David Thoreau, his writing of civil disobedience and what he learned from the life of Henry David Thoreau in a lot of ways provided him a roadmap that he wouldn't have had otherwise. So Henry David Thoreau, based on who he was, cast a shadow on Dr. King. And Dr. King admitted that he would not be who he is without the life of a Henry David Thoreau.
Which, incidentally, let me interject here, Linal. I mean, that's another aspect of Dr. King's influence. I mean, his willingness to acknowledge influences from other traditions and other thinking, other ethnic groups. You know, that we have an ecumenical potential. I mean, our diet is global. And we shouldn't restrict ourselves to kind of provincial ideas.
Yeah, I love that. And you raise a good point, both of you, because I'm thinking even about Pan-African movements in modern day, like right now. Yeah. And there are certain people that you're supposed to read, quote unquote. You know what I mean? You're supposed to be in tune with Marcus Garvey, supposed to be in tune with James Baldwin. Certain things you're supposed to read. And then anything kind of outside of that may have come from other cultures, it's a little foreign, and what it does is it limits your perspective.
Absolutely.
And that doesn't cast aspersion on the people that we learn from, from the Black arts movement, from the Civil Rights movement, but it also just means that we can expand even beyond that and see where they got some of their concepts from.
Absolutely. And one of the questions that I always ask myself is, what if Thoreau had never gone to prison for what he believed? Then Dr. King, the concept of that they taught in the Civil Rights Movement in terms of, we can go to prison. I was listening to watching David Letterman. He interviewed John Lewis, and John Lewis is like, I've been to prison. Like.
How do you like those David Letterman interviews, by the way?
I only watched the first one, but let me tell you, it was actually very insightful into the life of President Obama, but also insightful into the Civil Rights Movement. He did a phenomenal job looking into the Civil Rights Movement, and then he also brought Senator John Lewis, into the conversation. And Senator John Lewis talked about this whole concept of going to jail and how he's gone to jail over 20 times before he was a senator and 5 times since he's been a senator. In terms of pushing the movement, right? And that in itself, if you remember, John Lewis didn't go to President Trump's inauguration. And President Trump insinuated that he was lazy and did nothing.
Right.
And it's just kind of like, really? Wow. I mean, here is one of our heroes.
Exactly.
But once again, this whole concept of going to jail came from Henry David Thoreau.
Yeah.
And then the other person that he talked about was Dr. Mordecai Johnson, and then of course Mahatma Gandhi's teachings from the movement in India, right? So that concept of personal immortality was the second piece. The third piece for me was this idea of somebodiness, right? And think about I think about the plight of African Americans at that time, and Salim, you probably can speak to this better than I can. So please fill in whatever blanks, and we got some phone calls coming in, so we will definitely be getting to those phone calls at the top of the hour. But here we are, and thinking about my grandmother, who said, look, Dr. King came in and upset the apple cart. Life was good, right? But at the same time, she was disadvantaged. And this idea of somebodiness, right? I am somebody. And this idea that the fact that we must develop in ourselves a deep sense of somebodiness, right? I mean, he was talking about self-actualization back in a time when people didn't talk about that type of thing.
That's true. Hey, except Reverend Ike.
Yeah. Right. So from that perspective, to me, as a matter of fact, I want to play a speech, a short snippet of a speech that Dr. King talked when he talked about somebodiness. Right now, I'm gonna play it real quick, and then definitely want to move on to you, Dometi, and then we're gonna get to some phone calls real quick. But here's a clip of Dr. King speaking on somebodiness.
I went to high school on the other side of town, to the Booker T. Washington High School. At that time, it was the only Negro high school in Atlanta. And I had to get the bus in what was known as the Fourth Ward to ride over to the west side to the Booker Washington High School. And in those days, rigid patterns of segregation existed on the buses, so that Negroes had to sit in the back of the buses. You know about this. Whites were seated in the front, and often, if whites didn't get on the buses, those seats were still reserved for whites only, so Negroes had to stand up over empty seats. And I went through that experience going to school at the Booker Washington High School, but my parents taught me something very early. Somehow they instilled within me a feeling of somebodyness, and they would say to me over and over again that you are just as good as any child in Atlanta, Georgia. And I would get on that bus day after day, and I would end up having to go to the back of that bus with my body. But every time I got on that bus, I left my mind up on the front seat. And I said to myself, one of these days I'm going to put my body up there where my mind is.
How about that? How about that?
I love that.
On somebodyness, right? So, I mean, so you can imagine the impact that's having on me in my early 30s when I'm going through all of these different lessons that I'm getting from Dr. King. So if anybody wonders, like, you know, how did Linal Harris get to be Linal Harris? You know, it was this research shifted me, as you can imagine, right? Shifted me and shifted my perspective on the movement, but shifted my perspective on my own personal power and the impact that I can make on people as a result of having learned some of this. And I have other virtual mentors, but of them, I would say Dr. King has given to me repeatedly, as you can see, in terms of little small clips like that I listen to that really move me forward, right? So those are my three. Those are my top three.
Oh, those are powerful effects, man. You know, and again, like he's such a towering figure that he has those kinds of effects and on many levels, man. You know, even tactically, you think now about how he utilized the creed of this country to force it to make changes that were very, very difficult for it to make. But the creed, its own belief in its own creed, he used effectively to motivate this country in ways that probably wouldn't have been motivated had someone less skillful been at work trying to do that.
Yeah. So, well, if you just joined us, you're listening to Inspirational Perspective with Linal Harris. I have Dometi Pongo in the studio with me and Salim Muwakkil on the phone. We've been talking about the life of Dr. King 50 years later, Dr. King's legacy, and you're getting three perspectives from three generations, a boomer, a Gen Xer, and a millennial. And we're going to be hearing Dometi's perspective and highlights of Dr. King's life as a millennial from him at the top of the hour. But before we do that, I want to take a couple of phone calls to close out the hour. And so we'll start with Malcolm. Malcolm, how are you? Welcome to the show.
Good morning. How you doing, gentlemen?
Well,
Good morning.
I want to talk about the people who went before, the ones who sort of created the consciousness of a Dr. King or Malcolm X or Elijah Muhammad. People like my great-grandfather, who was a master carpenter in Union, Alabama. And white people would come to him to do work. He could build your house from the ground up. A white insurance man hit on my grandmother sitting on the porch one day. And his name was Thomas Thompson. He was half Indian, half African American, and he went and got his rifle, came back to say a word, knocked that white man down the steps off of his porch, and drug him out of his front gate. And all the women in the family were just screaming and hollering and crying, they're going to kill you, you know. And he got his shotgun and sat on the porch and said, all right, I'm ready, let them which come get me. Okay, now the sheriff, when he heard about it, and they told him who it was, he said, you talking about that crazy Negro, Thomas Thompson? He said, no, I'm not going down there saying anything to Tom. That Negro is crazy, okay? My uncle, when I lived in Pennsylvania for a while, there was a racist white teacher who paddled me so hard with one of those wooden paddles, something I didn't even do. And my uncle, who was a coal miner, and a master hunter and stuff like that, Union man. He grabbed me, took me up to school. I thought he was getting ready to take me up to school and spank me in front of the class like sometimes people used to do.
Right.
He went in there and he had his rifle with him. And he took that panel down off the wall that this racist white guy beat me with and made him bend over the desk and beat him with
Wow.
What?
Okay. They called the sheriff. By him being a coal miner, he and the sheriff were friends because they were coal miners in your union together. The sheriff came, said, Tom, his name was Tom too, Thomas Allen. He said, Tom, give me that rifle. My uncle gave him the rifle. He put it in the back of his squad car. He said, now you get the heck out of here. Take your nephew and go home. He said, I got this. I'll handle this, okay?
Wow.
My grandmother used to tell me, told a white woman off so bad one time, we were Catholic. She used to sell medals and things and statues, and this is St. Agatha's on the west side. And the woman kept asking her questions. My grandmother told her, she said, look, don't ask me about my damn business. Now, this is the daughter of Thomas Thompson, okay?
Okay.
Ask me about my damn business. So you white folks got a bad habit of asking us Negroes all our personal business. Don't ask me about my damn business, okay? So I grew up in an atmosphere like that. My mother used to get, who was a beautiful dark-skinned black woman, would get all dressed up and go around the places where she knew darn well they weren't going to hire her, and she would dress me up in my little suit. And we went to Marshall Fields one time, and she sat there with her legs crossed, standing and singing in the office, black or white, and went up there to fill out an employment application just as big, sat up there and did her nails, and the white woman was just fine. They were livid, and the personnel manager was livid. He kept asking her, well, don't you have somewhere to go, honey? We have to do the application. So, and from a family of radicals, okay?
Yep.
And then I became radical myself as a teenager. So we need to talk about the people like my great-grandfather, my grandmother, my uncle, and people like that who created the consciousness of people like Martin Luther King and Elijah Muhammad and all these people, and tie this whole thing together, our whole history of this consciousness. So we need to talk about that. I love King and everything he did. Let's talk about the whole thing, what made King, and now what is making what we have become now. We got to get rid of things that's good.
Malcolm, that's a great segue into the next hour, brother. I appreciate you so much. I appreciate the phone call and the perspective that you just shared. Stick around with us. We're going to be talking about how to move forward, the 3 highlights from Dometi, and how to move forward going into 2018.
Up to the task of
all right. Hey, I hope you guys are enjoying this as much as I am. I'm telling you, we got a beautiful thing going on right now. Salim Muwakkil on the phone. Dometi Pongo is in the studio. Dometi, anything else you want to say, man?
Man, in this conversation, I think, I don't know, we'll probably move on, so I won't get a chance to say it on air, but when a lot of people think about activism, what they can do in their communities, they look at marching, they look at joining organizations, they look at all of these things that feel like it's outside of themselves or overextends themselves. Malcolm just talked about 3 people that had a profound impact on him just by sticking up for their family unit. Yep. So sometimes the most radical, the most impactful form of activism is creating the best family unit for you, because Malcolm carries that legacy with him, and he does whatever he does to move the movement forward. So it's not always about what it is for what you're doing for Chicago, how you're reacting to Laquan McDonald or something like that. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is create a better life for the people within your household and instilling in them the wisdom that you've gotten. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
Malcolm gave me that. That's real.
Yeah, that was phenomenal. So, and Emmanuel, what about you, man? I mean, how's this? I mean, you're in here, you're supporting us, appreciate it, but you, my brother, are brilliant, and you have a perspective as well. So, anything that that this strikes you with in terms of what you've listened to in the last hour?
Honestly, I'm just thinking I need to learn more about Dr. King. All I have is like what I learned in elementary school and like what I learned in Black History class. But just listening, taking it all in.
Awesome.
It's good to see you, by the way, man.
Yeah. So, thank you guys for sticking around with us. We're looking to definitely. I can't wait to hear what Dometi is going to share in terms of his perspective. The millennial perspective, and then have a conversation about how do we move forward, right? How do we move forward considering what's happening right now in the United States, as a community? What are some of the things or places that we should be looking to further empower ourselves and further empower the community. Right now, given the current administration of the United States, how do we go about that? I think in some ways we're sitting, on the sidelines silently while some pretty big moves are being made. And this may be a time where we should be a lot more active than what we are. And then why aren't we active, right? I think one of the things that has become a disadvantage for us in the 21st century is this mode of entertainment. It's so easy to just basically, check out and be entertained and not necessarily really feel the impact of what's happening, or even think about the impact of what's happening and what that can have on not just us, but our children in the future. So we'll be discussing that in a moment here, right after this commercial break. Stick around. Hey, share the feed. If this has been good for you, share the feed. What's going on, brother?
I see you on the way in. That show was like,
Yep.
you saw me running in?
Yep. Patrick, by the way, the technical producer. So definitely appreciate him.
Yeah. One of my old students, and then I ain't gonna say
Did all y'all go to ICB?
Nah, but I was on Dawn, so I was just on when he was
Okay.
on, when I was young.
Okay, got it.
PD, I had my own show, and he was my co-host.
Dometi. So when we open,
These are great. Thank you.
when we open the next segment. Sorry guys, we got to do some technical stuff before we're back on the air. But before we open the next segment, I'm gonna read your bio. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So we come on, and then you can share your top three. Cool. And then Salim and I will provide some conversation. I'm gonna go to calls, and then after that we'll go to, what's next, and begin to have some dialogue about that. So, and I'm sure we get some calls on that too. So. All right. Hey, thank you guys, man. This is yeah, let me tell you something. If you're joining now and you didn't hear Salim open the show,
he was phenomenal, man.
Once this feed is over, you have to go back to the beginning and listen to Salim share his perspective on Dr. King, on the movement itself, and even some of what happened to him personally is moving. I didn't know Salim got shot in '68, man, the same year that Dr. King got shot. And it makes you wonder how many other black men, underwent violence in back then.
Right. Right.
So, man.
Is this the reason one?
Almost. Yeah, that's my.
You like I'm on so many promos. What made you switch the time?
They opened it up for me.
Got you.
Yeah, they opened it up for me, man. They wanted me off
Saturday
nights and on to Sunday mornings to make this type of impact. I mean,
right,
what's happening right now?
Yeah, to lead into.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's amazing.
So, Roy said he didn't. Hey, man, if you didn't hear Brother Salim, right after this, I want you to basically go back to the beginning of the show and spend some time listening to Salim, brother. Like that was.
It was phenomenal. And Salim is still, man. People don't know how many doors he's opened for me either. Like just behind the scenes, from he'll include me in lectures he's been doing at universities. We spoke at Dominican University. He's come to the Artist Lounge open mic, dropped some gems and some wisdom on me, and kept it moving. I mean, he's humble, and he moves in a way where people just, think of him just this erudite. But back in the day, Salim was and he still is a mentor to so many people, and he still has a tremendous impact. So his history is crazy. So I only get it in snippets. Like I get a chance to hear it right here, and it's amazing.
All right, we're back on. All right, we're back on.
I'm gonna wake up as soon as it's done.
You're listening to Inspirational Perspective with Linal Harris on 1690, The Talk of Chicago.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right.
All right, we're back. You're listening to Inspirational Perspective. I'm your host, Linal Harris, Chicago's very own life coach, right here on WVON 1690 AM, the talk of Chicago. Well, if you missed the first hour, I'm telling you, you missed a phenomenal beginning to the conversation on Dr. King 50 years later. 3 generations, 3 perspectives. I have on the phone right now with me Salim Muwakkil. And in the studio with me, Dometi Pongo. Emmanuel Leonard is also in the studio helping us out. Patrick, technical producer, who is doing a phenomenal job. But we've had a phenomenal discussion so far. That discussion was highlighted at the end by a phone call from Malcolm, who shared in a lot of ways, and Dometi, you had some perspective on this off the air. So why don't you share the impact that Malcolm's call had on you? And then I'd love to formally introduce you and hear the 3 perspectives you have.
Yeah, really quickly, man. Malcolm, thank you for your call because you really showed the impact that managing a family unit can have on revolution. I think sometimes we think so much about revolution and activism in ways that are outside of our homes, outside of our neighborhoods, but it really starts at home. And when you have a grandfather who stands up for his family in that way, when you have an uncle who stands up for his family in that way, and a mother who is as audacious as yours was, and instill some values in you that you would then come and broadcast to hundreds of thousands right here on this radio station, so that legacy lives on through you, and they didn't have to necessarily go out into the street and do it. They did it right from their front porch with their rifles in hand. Mm-hmm. And I think that sometimes we get away from that, especially in my generation. You think that tweeting means you're an activist, or you know what I mean? And yep. All of those things have their place, but managing your family unit in a real sincere way and in a strong way, in a way with integrity that impacts the next generation has its place too.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. So, Dometi, here's what we're gonna do. I got a few phone calls that they've been waiting for a while.
Let's go.
I wanna clear some of them out, and hear from them real quick, and then hear from you. And so
let's go for it.
I have Anita. Anita, how are you?
Good morning. How are you?
I'm well.
Boy.
Okay. Excuse me. I wanted to say something about. First of all, I need to know when Salim said he was shot. I didn't hear exactly the circumstances you were shot in, Salim.
So you know what, Anita? I'm gonna ask you and any listener that wants to hear more of what Salim shared at the beginning of the show, because what we want from Salim is what's happening right here, right now. You can go to my YouTube channel later and hear the entire interview with Salim, or which is Linal Harris, Linal, or you can go to the Inspirational Perspective Facebook page and pick it all up and check out the whole thing. But did you have anything else for Salim?
No, my comment was going to be, I didn't hear if he said he got shot in the war or he was shot with the protest, but don't talk about it. But anyway, this is what my comment is, Salim. You know I listen to you all the time. I listened last night, too. I didn't call him, but anyway, I think we need to change this movement from nonviolence to non-oppression, okay? Because then it would incorporate some of the military strategies needed if you have to go against the powers that be that are oppressing you. You cannot keep saying nonviolent and they're using violence on you. You have to make sure that they cannot just come in your community and massacre your children and think it's okay because they're the ones that's ruling. So I think the problem between the so-called military movement of what they said Elijah Muhammad was versus what Dr. King said. You know, that Dr. King, that's for forgiveness of Caucasian people. If they want out, you're supposed to jump out right away, because the people that's coming in to protect their children aren't necessarily coming in with a kind attitude to you killing and massacring their families, okay? So you got to change that from nonviolent to non-oppressive. Now, they've had many years to get this straight, and they haven't. So some of that's going to cause death to their own children. If you don't move your children out of harm's way by doing the right thing, then you're going to open yourself up for your own children being massacred by your own way of doing things. Because remember when Moses, Pharaoh kept putting plagues on him, and then Moses said, well, the next plague that you let run out your mouth is going to affect your family. So if you can live by the standards you want me to live by, then maybe I might think about it. Psych, I'm not going to do it.
All right.
For all those black, can I say one more thing? For all those black people that think they're going to take the Jesus movement and put it on just the African American people and not on the Caucasian people, you might as well step over there with the Caucasian people, because I believe in non-oppression. And if you're in my way, I don't care what color you are, you're going to get it. Go learn your religion or whatever you're doing, because people are not going to take that smack off you talking about you're black and you're oppressing me worse than Caucasian people.
Got it. Anita, thank you for your perspective. Salim, your thoughts?
Pardon me?
I was just asking your thoughts on what she shared. I mean, she shared two different concepts. I definitely have my thoughts. I can go in as you collect yourself if you like, but I think she was pointing it towards you.
You know, again, one of the things about Dr. King that has impressed me as I study, and because I'm always studying, I'm always a student, and I begin to appreciate his ahisma. Ahimsa is actually what you call it. Ahisma is like a principle in Vedanta religion of do no harm. It's a principle in a lot of the earliest spiritual practices. Just do no harm, and that's the highest form of compassion for humanity, I think. And it's also, you know, a courageous thing to do, and often we don't see that. And so there are tactical things we have to do, though, as I think Sister Anita was talking about. There are tactical things we have to attend to that make our lives better on this practical realm. But I think in a larger sense, that King had other things that were of concern to him.
Got it. Dometi, anything from you, brother, in terms of what she's talking about?
I'll get into it a bit when I talk about the things that impacted me about King. But I think Salim's point about the importance of King as a spiritual guide, and that he followed a spiritual order, I think that informed a lot of how he moved and a lot of the way that he went about activism. So we can't neglect that even if we disagree with his tactics, that it came from a place of a spiritual order. Yeah. And that was one of the biggest things I learned from him. Because as I learned about King, actually, the year that I started to read more about Dr. King was the same year I got saved and gave my life to Christ. Okay. And I read two books around that time. I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, read the Bible, of course, then a few months later I read the autobiography of Dr. King. And I started to see the importance of a spiritual order. And so when you feel like you have a spiritual mandate on your life, you move in ways that aren't necessarily practical. Yeah. And I don't even know if King...
And people won't understand.
And people won't understand. And I don't know if King even necessarily, using logic, thought about nonviolence as a tool. I think that was kind of a spiritual mandate for him.
Got it. You know, and here are my thoughts on it, too. She made mention of, you know, black Christians versus white Christians. And I talked about this on the show before, that I think often... You know, it's unfortunate that we have these tags, right? Because, you know, a lot of people can wear a particular title who don't necessarily really truly line up with the ideologies of Christianity, right? And I think what happens is we look at the whole and we say, well, you know, white Christians are acting this way, black Christians are doing this. And we begin to separate based on what we see, when in essence, truly, if all Christians were being Christ-like, at least in the United States of America, we would not have the situation we have, period. So to me, then it is no longer a conversation about Christianity or black Christians and white Christians. It becomes more of a conversation about personal integrity. And let's take out Christianity. Let's take out Islam. Let's take out any other religion, and let's just talk about personal integrity. Who is it that you intend to be? And are you aligning with that thing? And if you're not, you're out of integrity. I can't tell you, Dometi, that you're out of integrity. I can't tell you, Salim, that you're out of integrity. What matters is who you all intend to be and how you intend to show up. And that's the thing that I think we all need to be looking at ourselves. Who am I being? I'm not going to look over and say, well, Dometi said he was saved. I can't believe he's doing X, Y, and Z. Right. And if it's bothering me that much, then instead of being offended by it, then let me step into a spirit of courage and approach you and say, hey, I see something over here. It's been impacting me, and I want to have a conversation about it, right? And as two men, we can, engage in that dialogue. But I think too often, we're looking at people from the outside, we're making judgments, and that consumes us. And so as a result, I can't step into my own personal integrity and my own personal power and push forward on the things that matter to me because I'm distracted by what other people are doing.
Absolutely. And right, I mean, and that applies to this observation of Dr. King as well, because I remember at one point when I was teaching some college students, there was a sentiment that Malcolm X. This is during the time really when Malcolm was being marketed very effectively by Spike for his movie, and X hats were all over the place, and he even had X potato chips. And so Dr. King was given short shrift at that time. He was seen as something that was passé, something who represented an ancient ideology, and that's pretty much that same thing. People were choosing, a team, and the other team was the loser. They were choosing Team Malcolm and Team Martin were the losers, and that kind of thing often happens as well. And I'm glad that I think we've seemed to have gone beyond that.
Yeah, in some ways, I think we still have a lot to do. As a matter of fact, I was listening to your show last night, Salim, and we were talking about some of the current discourse among African American quote unquote leaders, right? And I appreciate your perspective on that because we got to get past this thing. And those of us who call ourselves leaders, then we need to really step up to the plate of leadership and fully employ the competence of leadership and move forward. So, all right. So Dometi Pongo, he's here. Gladys, I see you. Art, I see you. Robert, Sel, want you to know, just acknowledge you that we see the phone calls. What I want to do, though, is give Dometi the floor because one of the reasons we have him in the studio is we want to get the millennial perspective of Dr. King. And real quick, for those of you who don't know Dometi is also a former WVON teammate. And Dometi now anchors the Saturday morning newscast on Chicago's WGN radio, and he is the host of Brainstorm with Dometi, the podcast. He's also a multimedia consultant who produces and hosts content in partnership with the Chicago Urban League. He's engaged with the arts community, and he is also the host of the Artist Lounge, open mic in acclaimed art galleries and creative spaces on the south side and west sides of Chicago, of which I have attended, and you, my brother, are an amazing artist as well.
Thank you.
So thank you for being here on the show.
Just one correction. Call me a former WVON teammate. I'm an eternal.
Eternal. I like that. I like that. That's a good correction. That's a good. That's a good.
Right here.
A good correction.
No, it's great to be back, y'all.
Yeah, man. So Dometi, here you are. You're a millennial. We have our perspective of millennials, boomers and Xers, and I'm curious. What did you learn from Dr. King, and what perspectives do you have on Dr. King from your vantage point?
Three things. So first was around the time that I started to dig deeper and learn more about King. I was probably about 19 years old, and I went beyond what it was that I just read in my history books, and I started to go into YouTube and looking at these speeches. And one of the first speeches that I saw, as I looked up King, it was like, "This isn't the King." I think the title is something like, "This isn't the King they talk about in your history books," or something.
Got it.
And it's him talking about white supremacy and his deep distrust of white supremacy. And in this speech, Salim would know the title of it. I can't remember the title of the speech, but it's the one where he's talking about reparations.
Oh, yeah.
It's the one where he's...
I know which one you mean.
Yes, and it was around the time when he was promoting the Poor People's Campaign. I had never heard King... When presidents honor Dr. King, they never talk... They talk about "I Have a Dream." Any president has never spoken about this reparations speech.
I honestly think they took him out because of that. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah, I think it was the Poor People's because it unified the races.
Yeah. He was like, all right, guess what? We all poor people. I think King had an epiphany and said, wait a second. This is an economic thing.
Right.
And if I can unite, poor black people and poor white people and into this thing and make this movement about the poor, I'll really gain some momentum. And I think that the powers that be also saw what he was doing and said, oh, wait a second, this is why we established the institution of racism. We got to kill this man.
Right. And so at 19 years old, that was a time when I knew who I was.
What's that? And you know what? Hey, one of the things I believe, Brother Salim, I know I'm often optimistic, right?
Right.
But one of the things I do believe too is, in order to learn and protect ourselves and to advance, that we also have to take a look at history for what it is and say, well, what happened here? And if it's very negative, I have to be willing to accept that.
Absolutely.
I'm curious, Salim. What do you think of that theory?
I think you're on to something, man. That's always been the black band, of American policy is unity between black and white, a class unity, the Lincoln Rebellion. I mean, that whole tradition is absolutely frightening to the corporate structures that keep this country afloat. So
Yeah, and that was the very beginning of racism. I mean, so racism, when you start to look into the history books, evolved in Europe, but it came over with the Europeans to America, where they began to, with some of the clashes of the poor between the rich in the early colonies, where you had black landowners, right, who also had slaves. They began to realize, wait a second here. We got to figure out a different way to divide this thing up. And that's where they said, hey, this new thing that they've been doing around skin color. What if we got these white folks out of this conversation and we made this only about brown skin, especially since we're profiting from African slaves.
exactly.
And that's where it came from.
Yeah.
So that's why, in my opinion, when Dr. King began to unite the races and talk about poverty, they were like, whoa, wait a second.
It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
By the time when Fred Hampton was killed, he started talking and started uniting poor white people with the Black Panther movement. And he started to rebrand the Black Panther movement in a way around being able to do this intersectionality piece. And that's when he ended up getting killed as well.
Yeah, so I think you made a poignant point there, my brother. So
around that time, I knew who I was, but I didn't know how to present myself to the world, to the public, right? I had just gotten into college. I still was ingratiated in hip hop culture, but I saw King was the same way. I was like, he's much more revolutionary than he lets on when he's in these other spaces.
Yeah.
So it allows him to move in different spaces.
Absolutely.
Perhaps I could take a page out of that book. And so that was kind of what, and now I'm on WGN radio too. But no, that's
absolutely.
But that's something that kind of so that stood out to me. And then at that time, those were my formative spiritual years. And so as I read about the autobiography of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, I started to find out that they had visions all the time. Like you got that scene where Malcolm X has a vision where he sees the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And then there's this vision where Martin says he's writing his letter and he hears the voice of God telling him to do some things. It's a long story, but around that time, and I don't want to go into a religious debate or a theological debate, but just about this thing where we are all spiritual beings.
Absolutely.
And people who have had a tremendous impact on this earth in some way contended with their spirituality, no matter what their faith may be. Gandhi was guided by a faith, right? You know, the Dalai Lama, guided by a faith. So there's something there. And so it let me know that there was a reality, a kinship to great people and their spiritual identity.
And their spiritual connection. Absolutely. I 100% agree.
Yeah, and that was that. And then the last piece was discipline. And I started looking at the age that he did all these things. To me, King always kind of looked old. Like, he always looked, he was forever 40 in my mind. Yeah. Sorry, 40 ain't old. My bad.
Hey, no, it's all right. I get it.
But yeah, he always looked old. And then I find out that he had already had his PhD in his 20s. He led the SNCC in his 20s, and he was doing all of this early on in his life. And I said, well, how do you do this? Like, what is discipline? You know, and so how could I become a more disciplined person?
A great deal. I mean, when you listen to the speeches of Dr. King, and you listen to, one, the eloquence, but the message and what it is that he's portraying. I mean, I don't know that this brother had a speechwriter. I mean, Salim, correct me if I'm wrong, but he wrote a lot of those speeches.
He didn't have a speechwriter, no. This was coming off of his dome, man. He was an eloquent speaker and a very competent speechwriter. He was well grounded in philosophical,
yes,
texts and whatnot. So he came from a deep tradition of oratory, of religious oratory, but he added to that a kind of scholarship, and that was all.
Yes.
Yeah. No, it was an art to it. And I mean, and as I think about his ability to how skilled he was as a writer, it made me think about all of the black leaders we have, from Frederick Douglass, you name it. And I started to allude to this in the last hour. If not for having to contend with civil rights and social justice, who would these people be? Would Martin Luther King have been Steve Jobs? Like, would he have created the iPhone back then? Would we have had some black Henry Fords? Frederick Douglass could have very well been a president, right? He could have been. And so I started to think about how I could apply some of these tactics, this discipline and social justice stuff, to things that I wanted to accomplish, not just for black people, but for myself and my family. And so that I could be a bigger asset to black people at large after I received that, or during at the same time, right? So those are some of the things I picked up.
It's phenomenal.
Yes, sir.
Yep. Salim, anything you would add to what Dometi just shared?
It just reminds me, when you're saying that, it reminded me a little bit. I was talking about the Panthers a little earlier, and the Panthers had absolutely good intentions, and were audacious in the way they said, look, if nobody's going to help us change and better our community, we're going to do it ourselves. Simple as that. Yeah. But the Panthers lacked discipline, the kind of discipline that was necessary to get us away from the kind of dissipating lifestyles that we had become accustomed to. And a lot of times we were supposed to be somewhere, and we didn't show up because we, fell victim to those lifestyles. Yeah. And I realized how necessary discipline was. And that, again, the Nation of Islam became like a beacon in that way, because it represented that discipline. And again, Dr. King, as Dometi pointed out, also adhered to a strict kind of spiritual discipline that I think, didn't realize at the time, and now we're beginning to see just how powerful that discipline was.
To that point, Salim, and listening to John Lewis's interview with David Letterman, one of the things he talked about was the training that they went through. I mean, so think about that, right? And what I know about the movement is you could not be on the front lines unless you went through extensive training. Right. I mean, think about the discipline that takes. I mean, you have to show up somewhere after work. You have to go through your training. And the training wasn't just one day. I mean, and by the way, they antagonized you. They did all the things that they believed would happen to you. You had to, so in some ways you were being hazed almost by your own people to say, we need to make sure that you won't strike out. We need to make sure that you won't punch.
And let me, sorry to cut you off, but it makes me think about social justice movements now. I think when we talk about this legacy, I think we skip that piece. We're like, wow, I can't believe these people sat at the lunch counters and allowed themselves to be spit on and beat, and they never struck back. They practiced that.
They
that
practiced
wasn't
it.
Easy.
An extreme amount of discipline, a discipline that was anchored to a very clear what for. I know why I am doing this, right? And we talk about personal goals. We talk about personal efficacy, and what we want to do moving forward. I hope anyone listening can take from this that whatever it is that you want to achieve, whatever it is that you want to do, it takes a deep discipline and focus in a knowing what for why you're looking to create that.
Absolutely.
So,
Correct.
all right. Well, with that, I want to pivot to a few phone calls before we go into what's next. We got about 28 minutes left, so I'm going to ask those of you who are on the phone to be brief as you possibly can. We want to definitely, hear you out and answer your questions, but I also want to ensure that I employ these two brilliant minds as effectively as I can in terms of what's next for America. So I'm glad if you're listening, please call back because you held a sufficient amount of time, and I want to honor that. But next we have Art. Art, how are you?
Hey, good morning, young man. How are you doing?
I'm well.
Good morning.
All right. First of all, it bothers me when we intellectualize a way out of a thought or a principle. It seems like if you're more spiritual, you're more this, if you allow people to abuse you. And throughout the Bible and the Holy Quran, they show men that God respected fought, bled, and died and went to war.
Mm-hmm.
But you're more spiritual if you allow someone to abuse you. I think it's a false norm to say that black people are violent somehow, how we have to learn to be more submissive. We were never violent towards white folks. 80% of the people were passive.
True.
They allowed white folks to do whatever they wanted to do to black people throughout slavery and all of that. So to keep saying that, somehow we have to allow them to abuse us more. And if you retaliate, you are less spiritual or you are less. So neither was 100% correct. I think we intellectualize things to make it comfortable for us to figure out that somehow God or the Creator is going to use a bunch of whispers in your ear all the time to achieve a certain objective. You don't have to allow anyone to abuse you, mentally, physically, or spiritually. You do whatever's necessary to maintain yourself. So I think it's a misnomer to keep putting that out there. And to allow someone to spit on you and all that kind of stuff is ridiculous. That don't make you a smart man because you're standing there and somebody spit in your face and kill your children. I think that is just not correct.
So all right, in terms of that though, given the position of blacks in the South, if they had picked up arms, they would have been slaughtered.
Well, that is not true because I talked to a brother named Lamont. He showed it's a bunch of brothers who do documentaries on a lot of men, black men, who went to war and fought against the French and people who are supposed to have more power or more this. But if you believe in a higher power than God, then either you do or you don't.
Mm-hmm.
So either God's going to intercede or how he intercedes to help you win your battle or not.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't make sense for me to live and I'm going to live in fear and I'm going to live in these conditions just to say that I live. Either you're going to die for something. I choose not to die early, but I'd be damned if I'm going to allow someone to kill my family and as a human being, I can't prosper until somebody give me their blessing and I have to love them until loving me. I think that's a misnomer. I mean, I really, that to me is not. And then for y'all to dismiss that young lady when she said it, said, I had to learn how to. And it's so Dr. King was, I think he was a great man. I think he done a lot of great things. And he was very articulate. And I think that principle is an honorable principle and that works to a certain perspective.
Got it.
But at the end of the day, if you allow people to do what they want to do to you, we're going to be in worse conditions, especially we're more violent to ourselves than we are to the oppressor.
Well, I want to say this. Art. Yeah. I don't want you to misunderstand. Too. By the way, it's good to hear your voice. I haven't heard Art in a long time, so it's good to hear you. And you always add a great perspective. But no, I don't want you to misunderstand that we were trying to elevate one ideology over another. I just want to say that King's mandate, his spiritual mandate, he felt like that was what he needed to do. But Nat Turner was also a preacher. And Nat Turner also felt like he had a mandate from God, and that's what allowed him to carry out the revolution he carried out.
Absolutely.
That resulted in him taking out a lot of his oppressors. And he did that in a violent way, right? So, I mean, there are different perspectives, but the larger point that I was making is that it's hard for us to judge the perspective of someone who feels like they've gotten a mandate from God. And with that, they say, judge someone by their fruits. The fruits of King's labor, he's accomplished a lot, as you mentioned, and so has Nat Turner through different means. So that we all are pieces to a puzzle, and we all have different mandates and different purposes that we have to carry out.
Absolutely.
All right. Yeah. All right. And to Art, one thing, I want you to know that anyway, if the perception was that we dismissed Anita, I want to apologize for that, because one of the things I strive for is respecting the opinions of the callers, while sharing our perspective and opinion as well. So in no way did I dismiss what she said. I thought what she said was profound, and it's one of the reasons we spent time responding to it.
Yeah, as was your comments, Art.
Yep, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for the comments, Art. All right, I got Gladys. Gladys, how are you?
You make me happy to say, let me get in when you want me to fit in. I want to say, a.k.a. Goddess Aya Divine, my very new resident of South Atlanta. Brothers, all of you, I like to say, happy hotel in another happy year under racism and European domination to master in Zulu Saba. To you, Brother Salim, how about it, honey? Just always unity. So you know what? We got to get this. That's what I'm talking about. It's a psychological sabotage for us to have an annual ritual of the celebration of Kwanzaa, which it's not for total liberation. We got to learn those principles, and we get that. We won't have political nonsense news such as that dumb, dramatic Trump leading black men who was the father of the planet Earth. But I don't want to be too emotional, brothers, because I'm surrounded by all of your energy, and I just want to say that thank you, brother. Linal, and congratulations on all your new accomplishments. Now, this is what I want to say before I get too excited. I love what Brother Art and Sister Anita say, and I want to say about this personal integrity. People was like evil. They ain't got no personality. But listen here, I want to tell you something here. I love what Anita says. You do need to have I should say non-oppression. That would be wonderful. But listen, Mom, I want to say this here real quick, and I apologize. I fail to have articulation in terms of being like Dr. King, dyslexic, but I know what I want to say. I write it down. But I want to tell you this right here. My question is regarding the Honorable Martin Luther King Jr. in the 21st century. May I share with you that I am profoundly proud on behalf of Dr. Martin Luther King's vision versus his dream of a reality of our integration and a nightmare. So may I ask all of you your honest and opinion and expert participation to spiritually enhance 2018 to 2025 double duel of M&M, Malcolm, Marcus, and Muhammad, promised land, intergenerational Umoja alliance to address and resolve separate land reservations, 25 years no taxation, past due and present economic compensation, and last but not least, resources to secure PTSD, post-traumatic explaination, psychological rehabilitation. And so with that, would you assist this grassroots mobilization? And in addition, what do you think Dr. King's promised land vision would be today? And I say to all of you, Hotep, Jay, and come on, let's bring about the revolution, psychological independence from European domination. Brothers, you talk black to me, and have a black nigga so wonderful. Happy New Year.
All right, thank you so much for the phone call. Yeah, all right. So she asked some very clear questions there.
Yeah. Where you want to start?
Wow. I mean, because she kind of piled on the questions.
I know one that she put out there was what would King's vision be today for the next step of the fight?
Yeah.
And she mentioned reparations, and I think about organizations like Cobra. There's a group that have a newspaper out in Florida called The Burning Spear, but they're led by Omali Yeshitela, and they've been fighting and protesting at the UN and creating a framework for reparations and what that would look like, and giving examples, and just like Ta-Nehisi Coates did in his paper, giving examples of practical ways that we could look at what reparations might look like. And we've seen it done before for different communities, right? So I actually do think that would be the next step in the fight. I was a little dismayed. I was talking yesterday on my podcast about down in Atlanta, Killer Mike and T.I. become a part of Keisha Lance Bottoms, the new mayor of Atlanta, become part of a transition team.
Okay.
And I remember that I was asking Killer Mike, I'm like, you supported Bernie Sanders in the last presidential election, but he stopped short of supporting reparations. Bernie Sanders did.
Yeah.
Right, so it's like even the most progressive, the most left of the left of the left, I know that maybe that reparations conversation won't win you the election, so maybe that's why people don't, don't talk about it. So, who's to know what someone's real ideology is? But at the end of the day, we need to really start talking about reparations as a reality, because we didn't used to talk about the notion of a black president as a reality. So we say we'll never have a black president, and a lot of us think we'll never have reparations. We need to start looking at a framework that will make it palatable, because it at least starts with affirmative action, maybe, and then let's take it piece by piece and make it logical and make it something realistic and tangible.
Here's what I like about the conversation about reparations: is in order for reparations to happen, that means that the American establishment, the government itself, has to recognize the ills of slavery.
There you go.
Right. In order for that to happen, they have to say, you know what, that was a misstep. And like Sister Gladys said, that it has created a post-traumatic slavery syndrome within the African American community, which, as a coach, as someone who's working with people and guiding them, and we're having cerebral conversation, when I'm working with African Americans, they struggle with the particular context. And I do believe that context came from the history of slavery. And Dometi, you and I have had a conversation about the difference between Africans, right, who are here in this country, and African Americans who were brought over and descendants of slaves. Yeah, there's a different mental context that Africans have from African Americans, and I believe that gap, that shift, has to do with the trauma of slavery and the after effects of that, right? And so, because of the after effects, and by the way, the profit that a lot of these large organizations have received as a result of slavery, I think reparations is, in a lot of ways, not just money coming into the African American community, but in a lot of ways is a way to alleviate. I mean, you can never alleviate the sin, but at least address the sin of slavery, right? So, Salim, I'm curious about you. What your thoughts on that?
No, I'm listening to you, brother. You're preaching my gospel. That's exactly my line. Reparations. I'm thinking more and more that we should develop a reparations party, so that we will be very explicit in our agenda, and not blunt any points, and just be very specific, because that's exactly what we need. And the points that you're making, Linal, about the differences between us and immigrant groups is, I think, what I call a lack of cultural capital. It was that trauma of enslavement and the legacy of slavery, the way we were prevented from developing, from accumulating the kind of cultural capital that other populations do, because we were in this situation of enslavement and subservience. We were socialized for subservience.
Yes.
And we never had the opportunity to develop that kind of cultural capital that other immigrant groups have had to develop. And when they come here, they have that. And it orients their behavior. It encourages success because of that orientation. And we've never had that opportunity to develop that kind of capital. We had it here and there. I mean, I think it's an organic thing wherever people are living in self-sustaining communities, they automatically accumulate this capital. But we've never had the opportunity to live in self-sustaining communities. We've always had to adopt a predatory lifestyle in many cases, because we were on the edge of survival. And we couldn't develop that cultural capital. And I think that's our major problem. If we can develop that, no one can stop us. No one can get in our way.
Absolutely.
But we have to have that base.
Yeah. And to that point around the predatory lifestyle, that it's created that way, so then they can create the narrative around the violent black man, right? Yes, it's created that way, and also they can continue to push black prisoners into the prison profit establishment. So
they'll take advantage of our social failures.
Exactly.
Profit off our social failures.
Exactly.
Like a cannibalistic society.
Yep. Absolutely. Okay. I got a phone call from Robert here about the Southern response. Robert, you're on the air.
Thanks for taking my call. I'd like to address something Salim just said. He said other immigrant groups. There were some blacks who were here prior to or before the Mayflower.
However, the ones who were brought here in chains are not immigrants, migrant settlers, refugees, et cetera, et cetera. And when Dr. King stood up on the bus and looked at the empty seats, according to the United Nations Resolution 96I of 1945, I believe, that's an act of genocide, and it's a continuation. This one of the acts of genocide perpetrated on our people since we've been brought here.
Yeah.
Now, you talk about reparations. Reparations were paid to the slave owners, the plantation owners, for losing their livestock.
That's right.
Their livestock were one of the livestock was black people.
Yep, that's true.
They didn't lose their pigs, horses, cows, mules. They were paid $300 each for losing their livestock. Each person who had those slaves were compensated with reparations, and everyone else gets reparations except our people. Israelis get reparations who claim they were persecuted.
Not just Israelis, man, but Jews. I know Captain.
I'm just giving.
Well, the University of Chicago from German reparations.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a question about Judaism. Who are the Jews? I think Minister Farrakhan in the speech pointed to the audience. You are the real Jews, the Hebrews. And Cliff Kelly was sitting in the audience that day.
Yep. There's a documentary. There's a documentary on that about the lost tribes of Israel and how a lot of them are Africans that ended up in the slave trade over here.
Oh, so you're aware of that?
I am.
This is kind of history that the Generation X's and some of even the boomers don't know. I mean, we've been spoon-fed garbage over the years. And when Dr. King was at the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there were recognized two federally protected classes, blacks of African descent and Native American, which is not and then they realized that there was such a benefit from this. They threw in the whole crowd. It's like robbing the bank, and they stampede a herd of cows down the street to get away. They're getting away with it because now white women, gays, Hispanics, and so on down the list. Everyone's a protected class now. And the two halves that were cut from that pie, the Native Americans have their tax-free status, casinos, and what have you, and this is still their land. But we get crumbs from the crust of the pie. We don't even have a slice. And this came out of Dr. King's period, that everyone should be intellectualize the U.S. Riot Commission report. And Salim, you're familiar with the Kerner Commission report.
Yes, sir.
It's about identifying. We've been identified, tagged,
that's how I got my
titled, labeled, right. And everyone else, and then it tagged, but in that Kerner Commission report, it identified white community as the villains, the culprits. But we self-identify ourselves as ex-offenders, thugs, or what have you. But we've been placed in those conditions, and we are not fighting to identify, to educate our people as to their real positions, how we got there.
Yeah.
I'll let you go on that and you continue.
No, I love what you guys are saying about this idea of self-identification, the slave disorder, right? Because you have people who live in America who could be descendants of people who are already indigenous, black people who are already indigenous to this land, who identify with that. Like, I'm talking about reparations, but my parents are immigrants. I probably wouldn't get a red cent from it, right? So I'm not even fighting for something that is necessary to me, but I self-identify as an African American, having been in America my whole life, right? So there are elements of that post-traumatic slave disorder that I have to contend with what's possible for me, or the way I'm discriminated against is no different than the way someone born and raised in America several generations in is treated, right?
But Dometi, you are better equipped, I think, because of the cultural capital that your family brings.
I agree.
And we've talked about that. Dometi and I've had a personal conversation about that. And I told him about the blessing that it is that, in terms of generationally, he's not afflicted with some of the things that, some of us are afflicted with.
Exactly.
But you guys are right, and I think it does position us and people from the diaspora, give us a different position and a perspective to fight for the whole diaspora in a different way. But it also shows how pervasive that slavery is, to where you can still have some of these ideals, some of these concepts, and still be affected by slavery, even though you're not a direct descendant of it.
Yep, true.
That's how powerful culture is, man. It really is powerful.
Very powerful. All right, so gentlemen, what I want to do in the last 10 minutes, and we still have some calls, so maybe we'll get to those calls. But I think more importantly, like I said, I want to employ you all in terms of your thoughts around what's next. And Salim, I'd like to start with you. Your thoughts around. So here we've had this powerful dialogue about Dr. King. We've heard a lot of different perspectives on who we should be, how we should be. Your thoughts on us moving forward, 2018, 21st century.
One of the benefits of perhaps detriments of age is that you see patterns in our movements, and this period reminds me of another period in which Ronald Reagan came into office. There was a movement, a response to Reagan's ascension in the black community, which was toward nationalism, toward a hewing together, becoming more concerned with collective economic wealth and exercising our collective will. And I think that we're seeing that recur. Like Mays, Jackson, and Charles, and that what's in it for the black people sentiment. I think that's kind of the spirit of the times, and I see a pattern going on in that direction. And I think that that's a positive orientation for us. But I do think that we need to focus on reparations, man, until we get compensatory resources that will allow us to escape living on the edge of survival. We'll continue to have these problems of incivility in our communities, of violence in our communities, the kind of disproportionate violence and disproportionate dysfunction in our communities, and so we need to focus on ensuring a base of resources, and I think reparations will do that.
Got it. Very nice.
I believe that. I think right now with social media, I think it's so everyone can have an opinion, and sometimes social media feels really loud with different perspectives.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that it gets to the point where if you're not embracing a certain brand of activism, that you become an enemy of certain communities, right? So Coates is arguing with Cornel West, and West is arguing with Umar Johnson, and let's not forget, Booker T was arguing with other black intellectuals at the time too.
Him and W.E.B. Du Bois. Yeah.
Absolutely. So that discourse is healthy, but sometimes it just feels compounded with social media because we're inundated so often, and I think that
it's so public.
It's so public.
It's so personal, man.
Yeah.
It's prominent,
It's not on merit, right? It's not on principle. It's not on the idea. You start to, it goes from your perspective to your mama, like
real quick.
Real quick, it changes, and I think that it makes people shy away from sometimes activism or black nationalism. People who could be an asset to certain communities, people who have been able to get into certain spaces feel disconnected from the black community because they've been called times, or maybe they don't ascribe to a certain ideology. And I think that we need to embrace a different form of unity and see that people can fight in different ways. If this person works in that space, he gives us access to that space. He may not give you the level of access that you feel he should give you, but again, the devil right? Exactly. It's better to have that person there than anyone else, I think. And I think that our generation is uniquely positioned to start building wealth. And without wealth building, we won't have an economic base to support a lot of these activists. I was talking about, this case with Kanika Jenkins and this GoFundMe page that happened. She was the girl that went missing and found in the freezer, Rosemont Hotel. And then there was a GoFundMe page in her name, several of them put up that the family didn't authorize, right? That weren't real, right? And we wouldn't even point the finger at maybe these guys did, these activists did it if they had an economic base. They would need the money, right? At the end of the day. So we need people who are doctors, who are lawyers, or who are carpenters, who are plumbers, who just have disposable income that they can help and fund the movement. And some people who pursue education, who pursue careers, they're not being they're not pulling out of the movement, but in fact, they're becoming assets to the movement in different ways, even if they don't engage personally, even if they don't read every single black nationalist book. That doesn't mean that they aren't for the cause. It just means that they have a different cause in the fight. And so I think wealth building, figuring out how we become pieces to the puzzle and being more amicable with each other with people who don't think like us, man.
Yes. So I can appreciate both of those perspectives, and I agree wholeheartedly with both of you.
I actually endorse Dometi's perspective as well.
Yeah. And so not to necessarily repeat you all, but you all both know me well. And in the first place for me is for the black community is a sense of purpose. I think that we lack identity. And I say number one because I wholeheartedly agree with reparations, Salim, and the idea of unity, Dometi, I agree with. But I think in order for us to get to a point where we can unify first, right, that we have to have a sense of identity where, for me, it doesn't matter if Dometi sees something different. Because of my own personal identity and my ability to stand as a man, I can respect that difference, right? And look at Dometi as my brother and not pull him down. And so that for me, that's number one, purpose and identity, because that I believe that in itself provides a template and a structure for knowing where each of us individually, we kind of know our role at that point in terms of a unified movement. Okay. And then that's where number two for me is unity, right? So once you have purpose and identity, now I know where I fit in this conversation. I know where I fit with the Dometi and a Salim because I know who I am. And so I can work with these brothers despite agreement and create powerful unity. And one of the things that really strikes me is how quickly we judge one another and how quickly we jump on one another for anything. I mean, I saw this live stream of Dr. Umar in court, right? And it hurt my feelings. It hurt my feelings, right? Do I agree with everything that Dr. Umar says? No. Do I agree with some of what he says? Yes. Am I for him? Absolutely. Absolutely. Because of what he stands for and because of the vehicle that he can be for our community. And then lastly, Salim, the idea of reparations for me is an idea that if the United States said, oh, you know what, there is something we must do, then it is them acknowledging the sin. And that's where the healing can begin.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that would be the major turning point.
Yep.
If that acknowledgement happens.
So for me, it's those three in those orders in terms of us moving forward, and that's why I do the work that I do, and that's why I focus in the places that I focus right now. That's why you hear me talk about purpose. That's why you hear me talk about identity, and that's.
My brother, keep focused.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Good job.
So I want to thank you all, Dometi. How can people find you, real quick?
You can find me at dometi.net. That's DOMETI.net. All of the content, podcast, things I'm working on, you can find it there. And thank you guys for supporting me all these years.
Salim?
Just look at NBStimes.com. You can find my work, many of my pieces, or just Google Salim Muwakkil, and you'll see many articles pop up.
Follow both of these brothers. They're brilliant. My name is Linal Harris. You can find me on social media at Linal Harris, LINALHARRIS. Thank you all for listening. I appreciate you. Those who we didn't get to on the phone, please, next time I will prefer you. Have a wonderful Sunday morning and a great start to the new year. For my Slay Your Goalers, 30 minutes to the first conference call, coaching and training. Thank you guys so much. Appreciate you. Love you. Have a phenomenal beginning to your week.
When it said ballistic missile, this is not
What's
a
that?
drill.
Who made that beat?
Young Blaze, man.
Oh,
You don't know who Young? Oh, I gotta connect y'all.
That's hard.
Yeah, Young Blaze. Hey, so thank you guys for listening. I hope you got as much as I did out of this conversation. Dometi Pongo, everybody.
Hey.
Emmanuel, you wanna come over, man? Yeah, Dometi Pongo.
I'm just being nosy. I'm reading the comments.
Yeah.
Rodney, what's going on?
Yep. Emmanuel Leonard.
What's up, guys?
Yep. It takes a team. You got Patrick over there. He's our technical producer, so I want to thank him for all the work that he's done. But hey, man, thank you guys so much for joining. I hope that this segment has been helpful and in a lot of ways thought-provoking, and that it will help us all move forward in a way that will make a significant shift for who we are as a community and this great nation that we live in 2018 and beyond. So, thank you all so much for joining. Thank you for the support. And, hey, this is my purpose right here. These type of conversations, this type of work. And like I said, purpose and identity, that's something you all will hear from me a lot on this show. So continue to listen. That's the role that I play in all of this. So
role you play well, brother.
Yeah, I appreciate you. So,
yeah,
all right, man.
You, man. Thank you for having me,
Yes, sir. Thank you for being here, brother. All right, and please share this if it made a difference for you, and let them know. Hey, it's 2 hours that I believe will be well worth it for them to invest in, more so than any movie they can watch. All right, thank you guys again, and have a phenomenal day.